Okay, welcome friends to today's session. Today I'll be taking you through how to make bar soap using locally available materials. But now, before we go to original process of making soap, I'll be taking you through calculations. How do we calculate the requirements needed for making soap from different fats? Now, today, the process of making soap is what we call the saponification. Saponification, the process of making soap. And when you are making soap, the process involves the reaction between the fats or oils reacting with sodium hydroxide. This sodium hydroxide is what we normally call lye. We can call it lye, or other people use another name like caustic soda. So when you get fats or oils, react them with lye, which is sodium hydroxide, we get the soap and then glycerin. Now, today we want to see which fats can we use for you back in the village or you're at school and you want to make soap. And you're asking yourself which fats or which oils can we use. Today we shall be going through understanding the calculation process. We want to know how do you know the amount of sodium hydroxide you need to react with the fats. And this is the process that you're going to be going through in this session. So when you come here, we're saying that each fat or oil has a saponification value. The saponification value is simplified as sap value. So each fat or each oil has its own sap value, which tells us how much sodium hydroxide is needed to fully convert a given amount of fat into soap. So today we are going to see how we can determine the amount of sodium hydroxide needed maybe to convert 500 grams of fat into soap. But we are saying that each fat has its own sap value. So where do you get the sap value? We have the sap value on internet. When you go on internet and you tap there sap value of different oils, they'll be able to give you the saponification value of different oils. And number one, we are going to look at the pig fat. Making bar soap from pig fat. Now another name, the pig fat, is also known as lard. So we want to see, you're there in the village or at school and you're wondering which oils can we use for making bar soap. And we're saying that you can use pig fat, the one which you call the lard, to make bar soap. And now the question is, how do you know the amount of oils you're supposed to use, and how do you know the amount of sodium hydroxide that you're supposed to use when you're making the bar soap from lard? So when you go on the internet and you type there sap value of lard, they will be able to give it to you. The sap value, we are saying it is a saponification value. Saponification, we said it is the process of making soap. And we are saying that this sap value is the one which helps us to know the amount of sodium hydroxide needed to convert a given amount of oil into soap. So making soap, it involves only 3 major ingredients. And the 3 major ingredients we talk about in making soap. Number 1 is the fat or oil. Number 2 is water. And lastly is the sodium hydroxide, or what you're calling the lye. Or other people use another name like caustic soda. The caustic soda. These are the 3 major ingredients which we need to make bar soap. Now, in this case now, we want to see making bar soap from fat. And the question is, how do you know the amount of oil? How do you know the amount of sodium hydroxide? How do you know the amount of water needed to make a given to make bar soap from large. Let's go to step number 1. So in step number 1, we want to see how to calculate sodium hydroxide amount, the amount of sodium hydroxide. But don't forget that we said we can get the amount of sodium hydroxide from SAP value. And they're saying that the SAP value is 0.141 gram sodium hydroxide per gram of fat. How do we interpret that? Per gram of fat. It means that 1 gram of fat needs 0.141 grams of sodium hydroxide. Now, let's consider a case where you have like 500. Let's consider, we consider that you have 500 grams of lard. We said lard is the pig fat. Now, if you have 500 grams of lard, we want to find out how much sodium hydroxide do we need to add such that we are able to get our soap from the lard. So, when you consider this now, me, I'm considering 500 grams, but for you there where you are, you may be having a kilogram. You may be having 5 kilograms of lard. So, but the calculation does not change. We are saying that it is 1 gram of fat, which requires 0.141 gram of sodium hydroxide. If this requires this, what about the 500 grams of fat? So the 500 grams of fat will be 0.141 times 500 times 500 grams sodium hydroxide. So when you get this 0.141 times 500 grams, our answer, we can use the calculator, and then we'll be able to see that when you multiply that, we're able to get 70.5 grams of sodium hydroxide. You can see that we have killed two things at a go. We have known how much sodium hydroxide we need, and we know the amount of fat that is required. When you know the SAP number, and you have any oil, any amount of oil you have, then you can know the amount of lard, the amount of sodium hydroxide that is needed. So that was our first step. And don't forget that where you can get this saponification value from internet, go on Google and type there saponification value chart. It is already there, and you can get the chart having all the saponification values of different oils. Let's look at step number 2. Step 2. Let's look at step 2. We are still looking at making bar soap from the lard. And in step 2, step number 2, so when you come to step number 2, in step 2 you are looking at how to calculate water amount. Calculate water amount. We have already seen in step 1 how we can get if you have any amount of oil or fat, you can use the SAP number to get the amount of sodium hydroxide. That is done. So in this stage, step 2, which is our last step actually, we shall be looking at water. How much water are we using? So we are looking at calculating water amount. So a common ratio, we have a common ratio that we can use, a common ratio. A common ratio we can use for water. While making soap. And they're saying that the common ratio we can use for water while making soap, we can use a ratio of 2 to 5. 2.5 times the sodium hydroxide amount. 2.5 times the sodium hydroxide amount. So, simple mathematics. That is the common ratio. For example, in this case, where we have already calculated the amount of sodium hydroxide in the step number 1. In step number 1, we say that sodium hydroxide needed, we got 70.5 grams of sodium hydroxide. Don't forget that in this case we considered if you're having 500 grams of the oil. So if we got this one for sodium hydroxide, we are saying that for water now, the amount of water is equal to 2.5. This is 2.5 times the amount of sodium hydroxide amount, which is 70.5 grams. So when you multiply that, you'll be able to get 176.25 grams of water. So that is it, how we can calculate the amount of water for when we are using our pig fat, or what you're calling the lard. Please don't forget that we have been looking at making bar soap from lard. Okay, so now let's continue to another oil. In the previous, on number 1, we looked at making bar soap from lard. That was pig fat. Now in this number 2, we are looking at making bar soap from palm kernel oil. Palm kernel oil. Now, what does it take, and where can you get, by the palm kernel oil? Please, when you go in any retail shop, you can buy this. You can buy palm kernel oil, or you can still find out, follow, and you share, which you can see how best you can access some of these oils at from the nearby places wherever we are. So the question is, how do we know the amount of oil? How do we know the amount of water? How do we know the amount of lime, which is sodium hydroxide? So we say that for us to start calculating anything, we need to be knowing what we call the SAP value. And we say that each oil and each fat has its own saponification value. Saponification value of palm kernel oil, we are saying that it is 0.247 grams sodium hydroxide per gram of oil, which means each gram of palm kernel oil requires 0.247 grams of sodium hydroxide. Now the question is, where do you get this? As I said, utilize your Google. Go on Google, write their saponification value of palm kernel oil. They will bring you this. Now, we want to calculate the amount of sodium hydroxide, and we're saying that saponification value is the one which is going to help us. In this case, let's consider still like 500. This is just an example we're giving. If you have 500 grams of palm kernel oil, so if you have 500 grams of palm kernel oil, how much sodium hydroxide do you need to convert this oil into soap? So we are saying we are going to use the saponification value, where we have said that 1 gram of the oil requires 0.247 grams of lime, of sodium hydroxide. Now, if this 1 gram requires this, what about the 500? So this is, so which means in this case, the 500 grams of oil will require 500 times 0.247 grams of sodium hydroxide. And finally, when you get this times that, what do you get? You can use your calculator and you get the answer. But using mine, you can get 123.5 grams of sodium hydroxide. So you have already gotten, if you have 500 grams of oil, you need 123.5 grams of sodium hydroxide. Now, the second step is calculating step 2. We can calculate water amount. Calculating the water amount. Don't forget that we are still using the same method. There is a simple method we say that we can always use the water ratio. The simple water ratio we can use. So we say that the amount of water can be 2.5. In the first one, we are able to see that. 2.5 times the amount of lye. So the amount of lye we have is 123.5 grams of sodium hydroxide. So when you get 2.5 times 123.5 grams, what do you get? So the amount we get is 308.75 grams of water. As simple as that. Now, there are some people who are asking, how do you know the amount? How do you know the amount of these other additives? We have additives. You know, as someone who is making soap, you need to make sure you put in something that attract the customers. So when those are, we add what you call the additives. Some examples of additives we have, you can add the perfume, we can add the color, we can add, which other one? So you can add perfume, and this perfume can be in different styles, using maybe essential oils or any other. And then the color depending on what you want to make. Is it bathing soap or bar soap? So in my next video, I'll be taking you through how to calculate these other additives. If you're making 12 bars, if you're making 1 bar, how much perfume do you need to add? How much color do you need to add? So in my next video, I'll be taking you through that. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Please share with your friends so that they can always learn from what we are sharing. Otherwise, have a blessed time. Let's meet in our next session. God bless.